He sat in the car for 40 minutes after the meeting ended. The engine was off. The car park was nearly empty. A single fluorescent light buzzed above the entrance to the solicitor's office, flickering every few seconds like it was losing the will to stay on. On the passenger seat was a manila folder, and inside that folder was the answer he had spent 14 months and £11,000 trying to get. The answer was no. There was no legal remedy. There was no exit clause. There was no pathway to recovering a single pound of the £112,000 he had handed over 18 months ago, believing, genuinely believing, that he was buying his future. He was 45 years old. He had worked since he was 17. He had never once in his life made a decision he would describe as reckless. He had a spreadsheet. He had done research. He had read the documents. And he had lost everything. This is the story of how a man who did everything right by the standards he was raised with still managed to walk directly into a financial trap, so well designed that it looked, right up until the moment it closed around him, exactly like an opportunity. His name was Martin Cleary. He grew up in Coventry, the second of 3 children. His father worked the line at a manufacturing plant for 31 years and retired with a pension that was modest but dependable. His mother worked part-time in a school canteen and managed the household accounts with a precision that bordered on obsessive. They were not wealthy. They were not poor. They were the kind of family where buying something on credit was considered a moral failing, where savings were sacred, and where the phrase throwing good money after bad was deployed the way other families deployed scripture. Martin absorbed all of it. By the time he was in his early 30s, he had built what his mother would have called a proper foundation. He worked in regional logistics management for a mid-sized distribution company called Fenwick Freight, based out of Solihull. He had been there since his late 20s. He earned £54,000 a year, which was not extraordinary but was enough, and over 17 years he had built up a combination of workplace pension contributions, a Help to Buy ISA, and a savings account that had grown steadily to £122,000. He owned a semi-detached house in Leamington Spa with a remaining mortgage of £68,000. He drove a 7-year-old Volvo he serviced on schedule. He made his own lunch most days. He had a direct debit to a local hospice charity he had set up after his father died in their care. He was not flashy, not reckless, and by most reasonable measures, not the kind of man you would expect to find sitting in a dark car park 14 months after making the worst decision of his life. He had been divorced for 4 years when this story begins. His ex-wife, Karen, had moved to Edinburgh with their daughter Rosie, who was 11 at the time. They shared custody reasonably well given the distance, which meant Rosie spent most school holidays with Martin and most term time with her mother. Martin would drive to Edinburgh and back in a single day for Rosie's school events when he could. He kept a room decorated exactly the way Rosie liked it, with fairy lights along the headboard and a wall covered in postcards she sent him. He ordered the same Thai takeaway every Friday night and watched whatever Rosie wanted to watch on video call while they both ate. He was, in every observable way, a decent man doing his best. The redundancy letter arrived on a Tuesday in October. Martin had known it was coming for about 3 months. Fenwick Freight had been acquired by a larger logistics group, and the operational overlap between the two companies made middle management roles like his difficult to justify. He was 52 people in the Midlands region who all received letters on the same day. The package was fair, not generous but fair, and included a statutory payout plus an additional discretionary sum that brought his total redundancy payment to £31,400. Combined with his savings, he now had £153,000 in liquid assets, which felt in the first few weeks like a sum large enough to absorb the uncertainty. He was 44 years old, experienced, reasonably connected, and in logistics, which was not a dying industry. He applied for roles. He had conversations. He made it to final stage interviews 3 times in the first 5 months. 3 times he was thanked warmly and not given the job. The feedback when it came was never negative. He was described as impressive, thorough, and well-suited. He was also described, in language that was careful but legible, as someone whose experience level placed him above what the current budget could accommodate. He was too experienced to be cheap and too old to be a long-term investment. Nobody said that directly. They did not need to. By month 6, Martin had stopped telling Rosie he was close to something. He had also started thinking differently. He had always worked for other people. He had always been subject to decisions made above him. The redundancy had not happened because of anything he did. It happened because 2 companies merged and someone in a conference room decided his position duplicated another. His father had worked 31 years for a company and been handed out with a handshake and a clock. Martin had worked 17 and been handed out with a PDF. The pattern was clear, and for the first time in his adult life, he began to find it genuinely frightening. It was a colleague named Dave Prentice, someone he had known loosely from a regional managers conference 2 years earlier, who first mentioned the word franchise. Dave had left logistics 18 months before Martin's redundancy and had bought into a commercial cleaning franchise in the East Midlands. He was not loud about it the way some people were about business decisions. He mentioned it the way you might mention a new dentist, simply, practically, as a thing that was working out reasonably well. He had 3 client contracts. He had 1 member of staff. He was earning about the same as he had in his salaried role, but with none of the anxiety of waiting for someone above him to decide his future. He said that last part with a lightness that landed heavily on Martin, who had been thinking about exactly that anxiety for 6 months. Martin asked Dave how he had found his franchise. Dave sent him a link. The franchise was called CleanRight Solutions. It was a commercial cleaning operation that had been operating in the UK for 11 years. It offered what the brochure called a proven business system, which included branded materials, supplier relationships, client acquisition support, training, and ongoing operational guidance. The initial investment for a territory license in the West Midlands region was £94,000. There was an additional working capital recommendation of between £15,000 and £20,000 to cover the first 6 months before the business became self-sustaining. The total outlay would sit comfortably within Martin's liquid savings. The income projections in the initial franchise disclosure document showed a first-year net profit range of between £22,000 and £38,000, rising to between £41,000 and £62,000 by year 3, based on what the document described as typical franchisee performance. Martin read the document twice, then he made a spreadsheet, then he read the document again. He also did what he considered due diligence. He looked up the franchisor, a company called Meridian Franchise Holdings based in Milton Keynes. They had a website, a registered company number, and a listing with the British Franchise Association, which he had read was the industry's self-regulatory body. He found several online reviews that were positive. He found a handful that were neutral. He found 2 that were negative but attributed to franchisees who had not followed the system correctly, according to the franchisor's public responses. He called 3 existing franchisees whose contact details were provided by Meridian. All three spoke positively about their experience. He hired a solicitor to review the franchise agreement. The solicitor, a commercial lawyer named Gerald Hatch based in Warwick, spent a week with the documents and came back with a list of clauses Martin should be aware of. The list was long, but Gerald's overall verdict was that the agreement was broadly standard for the UK franchise sector. There was a 10-year term with no early exit provision unless both parties agreed. There was a resale clause that required the franchisor's approval of any buyer. There was a clause requiring the franchisee to use Meridian-approved suppliers at Meridian-set prices. There was a non-compete clause extending 2 years beyond the end of the agreement. Martin asked Gerald if he should be worried. Gerald said the clauses were restrictive but not unusual. Martin noted the resale restriction in his spreadsheet. He noted the supplier clause. He did not treat either as a warning sign. He treated them as standard features of the industry he was entering. He signed the agreement in March. He transferred £94,000 to Meridian Franchise Holdings on the 14th of the month. He kept £28,000 in reserve. He was 44 years old and he was, for the first time in his adult life, in business for himself. The first month was busy in the way that first months always are. Martin completed the 10-day training course at Meridian's head office in Milton Keynes. He learned the proprietary cleaning system, which turned out to be a branded version of procedures any experienced commercial cleaner would recognize. He received his territory map, his branded van signage, his uniform, his marketing templates, and access to the Meridian franchise portal, which contained client outreach scripts, quote calculators, and a ticketing system for operational support. He drove back to Leamington Spa on a Friday afternoon and parked the newly wrapped van outside his house. He stood on the pavement and looked at it, CleanRight Solutions, West Midlands, and a phone number. He took a photograph and sent it to Rosie. She sent back a row of stars. He did not know yet that the 3 franchisees Meridian had put him in contact with were the 3 most successful in the network. He did not know that the income projections in the disclosure document were drawn from those same 3 outliers, not from average franchisee performance. He did not know that 17 of the 29 active franchisees in the CleanRight network had reported first-year net income below £12,000, and that 6 had reported a net loss. He did not know any of this because none of it was in the documents he had been given. He would not know it for another 8 months. The first sign that something was wrong came through slowly, the way water comes through a ceiling. You notice the stain before you understand what it means. His client acquisition numbers were not tracking anything like the projections. The disclosure document had suggested that with consistent use of Meridian's outreach system, a new franchisee could expect to convert between 4 and 7 commercial contracts in the first 3 months. Martin converted 2. Both were small, a beauty salon in Kenilworth and a physiotherapy practice in Warwick, and together they generated just under £1,100 a month in recurring revenue. By the end of month 3, after his van lease, his cleaning supplies purchased through Meridian's approved supplier at what he was learning were above market prices. His insurance, his software subscription, and his fuel, he had netted slightly over £300 for the month. He called Meridian's operational support line. He was told that his outreach volume was below the recommended level and that he should increase his activity. He increased his activity. He converted 1 more client, a dental surgery in Leamington, adding about £600 a month. By month 5, he was netting roughly £1,100 per month. He was drawing down his reserves to cover his mortgage and living costs. He went back to the disclosure document. He reread the income projections. He pulled out the spreadsheet he had built before signing and compared it to his actuals. The gap was not small. His actuals were running at roughly 30% of the low end of the projected range. He started asking questions he should perhaps have asked earlier, though it is worth pausing here to note that the questions he was now asking were not obvious questions before you had lived the experience. He asked other franchisees, not the three Meridian had connected him with, but others he found through an independent online forum for UK franchise owners. What he found there quietly rearranged everything he thought he knew. The forum had a thread about CleanRight solutions that was 14 months old and 67 posts long. The opening post was from a woman named only as T from the Northwest who had bought a CleanRight territory 2 years earlier and was trying to understand whether her results were unusual. They were not unusual. Post after post described the same architecture of disappointment. Low conversion rates despite high outreach activity. Approved supplier costs that eroded margin to near zero on small contracts. An operational support line that responded with advice that sounded helpful but produced no measurable change. Income projections that franchisees described, in careful but consistent language, as impossible to square with real trading conditions. One post stood out. A man in the thread, posting as R from the Midlands, had written 8 months earlier that he had contacted a solicitor after his first year of trading showed a net loss of just over £4,000. His solicitor had requested the full franchisee performance data from Meridian under the terms of the agreement. Meridian had provided a document. The document showed median first-year net income across the network of £9,200. Not the $22,000 to $38,000 shown in the disclosure document. £9,200. Martin sat at his kitchen table and read that post 3 times. Then he looked at his savings account balance. He had £61,000 left. In 8 months between the franchise fee, the working capital he had spent, and the personal drawings he had taken to cover his living costs because the business was not covering them, he had spent or lost £61,000. And he was running a business that, based on what he was now reading, had a realistic median income in its first year of under £10,000. He called Gerald Hatch. Gerald listened. He asked for the documents. Martin sent everything electronically that evening. The question Martin wanted answered was direct and simple. Was the income information in the disclosure document misleading, and if so, what could be done about it? Gerald called back 4 days later. His voice had the particular careful quality that solicitors use when they are about to tell you something you do not want to hear, but that they need you to understand precisely. The disclosure document contained projections described as illustrative, not guaranteed. That word, illustrative, appeared in a footnote on page 14, below the income table, in a font several sizes smaller than the figures themselves. The projections were not, under the terms of the agreement, representations upon which the franchisee was entitled to rely. Gerald had checked case law. He had checked the British Franchise Association's code. He had spoken informally with a colleague who had handled a similar matter. The consensus was uncomfortable. The document was probably misleading in spirit but arguably defensible in law, because the disclaimer language, however poorly presented, was present. There was a potential claim, Gerald said. It would be expensive to pursue. It would likely take between 2 and 3 years. The legal costs would run to between £15,000 and £25,000, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Gerald was not in the business of encouraging litigation where the expected value was negative. He was laying out the reality, and Martin needed to understand it before deciding anything. Martin understood it. He also understood something Gerald had not said directly, but which was implied by everything he had described: that the franchise agreement had been designed carefully and deliberately in a way that made the franchise very easy to sell and very difficult to challenge. That the income projections were specific enough to attract buyers and vague enough to evade liability. That the supplier clause, the resale clause, and the non-compete clause together formed a structure that made exit expensive, resale difficult, and legal challenge risky. It had not been careless. That was the part that kept surfacing in Martin's mind over the following days. It had not been an accident. Someone had thought through every element of this carefully, and what they had built was something that transferred risk almost entirely from the franchisor to the franchisee while maintaining the appearance of a partnership. He still had a business to run. He owed it to himself to keep trying. He spent the next 4 months working harder than he had ever worked in his life. He was on the road by 6 in the morning most days. He converted 3 new clients. He hired a part-time cleaner to help cover the growing contract load. He renegotiated his van lease to cut costs. He found 2 approved suppliers who were cheaper than the ones Meridian had initially directed him toward, which was technically permissible within the agreement, but which generated a terse email from Meridian's compliance team suggesting he reconsider. He continued anyway. By month 12, his monthly net was just over £2,100. He had rebuilt to a point where the business was generating something recognizable as income. He was also working 70-hour weeks, driving 30,000 miles a year, managing a part-time employee, handling all his own administration, and still drawing down savings to cover the gap between what the business earned and what his life cost. He could not sustain the hours, and he knew it. He was losing weight. He was sleeping badly. He had missed 2 of Rosie's school events in the same term for the first time since she had moved to Edinburgh. He lay awake on a Thursday night in November, 12 months in, and did the one calculation he had been avoiding. He added up everything: the franchise fee, the working capital spent, the personal drawings, the legal fees he had already paid Gerald, the income he had not earned over the period versus what he might have earned in a salaried role. The number was not precise, but it was clear enough. He had entered this with £153,000 in liquid assets and 11 months of committed effort, and the business he had built was worth, by any realistic estimate, somewhere between £9,000 and £15,000 if he could find a buyer. He began looking for a buyer in December. The resale clause required any buyer to be approved by Meridian. Martin contacted 2 people who expressed interest after he listed the business quietly on a franchise resale site. Meridian declined both without providing reasons within the contractually required response period, then provided a brief letter citing concerns about both candidates' financial suitability. Martin asked what the specific concerns were. Meridian did not respond to that question within the period required by the agreement. He asked Gerald whether this was challengeable. Gerald had been down this road in the interim, and his view had hardened. Meridian's approval clause was broad. Their obligation to provide reasons was weak. A court might view their conduct as unreasonable, but getting to that point would cost more than the business was worth. The thread on the franchise forum had been updated. R from the Midlands had posted again. His solicitor had sent a formal letter before action. Meridian's legal team had responded with a document that was, in the poster's words, 3,000 words of very expensive nothing. The thread had new contributors: a woman from Hertfordshire who had bought in 9 months ago, a man from Lancashire who had been trading for 2 years and whose resale application had been declined 3 times. The thread was no longer about one person's unusual experience. It was a pattern. Martin read the thread with his second cup of tea on a Saturday morning in January. Rosie was upstairs asleep, 3 days into her half-term visit. He could hear the faint sound of her playlist playing through her bedroom door. He had made her favorite breakfast, smoked salmon and scrambled eggs, and it was sitting covered on the kitchen counter waiting for her to come down. He thought about his father retiring from the plant with the handshake and the clock, the pension modest but certain, the house paid off, the outcome legible. He thought about his own career, 17 years of building something that had been taken away by a meeting in a conference room he was not invited to. He had decided that would not happen again. He had decided to own something. He had owned something. He was just learning what ownership actually meant inside an agreement like this one. The thing that changed the story, the thing that nobody in the forum thread had found yet, started with a woman named Sharon Kemp. Sharon was a chartered accountant who had also bought a clean right territory based in the East Midlands, and she had been trading for 3 years. She had not been vocal on the forum. She was not someone Martin would have encountered through any of the channels Meridian had provided. He found her because she had posted a single comment on the thread in February, 9 words long. "I have the accounts. Anyone serious can contact me." Martin sent a message that evening. Sharon was methodical in a way that Martin recognized and respected. Over 6 weeks, they exchanged documents. Sharon had, through a combination of subject access requests, company's house filings, and a data disclosure her own solicitor had compelled from Meridian early in her tenure, assembled a financial picture of Meridian Franchise Holdings that was different from anything Martin had seen in the sales process. Meridian's accounts showed that franchise fee income, the money paid by new franchisees, accounted for 73% of their total revenue in the last 3 years. The ongoing royalty income from active franchisees, which should have been the dominant revenue stream if the network were genuinely profitable for franchisees, was a fraction of that. The implication was not complicated. Meridian's business model depended on selling new franchises. The success of existing franchisees was not the primary driver of Meridian's income. Recruiting new franchisees was. Sharon had also obtained, through a Freedom of Information query to Companies House, the names of directors associated with 2 previous franchise companies that had operated and been dissolved in the preceding decade. One director name appeared on both those dissolved companies and on Meridian's current filing. The director's name was not prominent on Meridian's public-facing materials. He was listed in the registered filings. He had not appeared in any of the conversations Martin had with Meridian's sales team. Sharon had spoken to a journalist at a trade publication called Franchise Business Today, who was aware of complaints about the Clean Right network and had been building a file. She had also been in contact, at arm's length, with 2 other former franchisees who had already left the network at a loss and who were willing to provide written accounts of their experience. And she had found, through a contact at a regional business association, that the British Franchise Association had received formal complaints about Meridian and was in the process of reviewing the company's membership status. The British Franchise Association review was the detail that mattered. If Meridian's membership was suspended or withdrawn, their ability to market new franchises using the association's branding, which appeared prominently on every document Martin had received, would be significantly affected. Membership was part of what had made the proposition look legitimate. It was part of what Martin had checked. It was part of what had satisfied him. Sharon had a deadline. The journalist at Franchise Business Today had a publication window of 6 weeks. The BFA review had an internal timeline that Sharon had been told, informally, was moving toward a decision within 2 months. If a coordinated group of franchisees could provide documented accounts within the next 4 weeks, there was a realistic prospect of a publication, a BFA action, and a reputational consequence for Meridian that might, Sharon said carefully, create enough pressure to bring them to a negotiated table. Not a legal claim, a negotiation. A franchise network facing a critical investigation by its own governing body. A simultaneous publication in a trade journal read by commercial property investors and franchise lenders. And a coordinated group of documented complainants was a different opponent than a single franchisee with a £15,000 legal case. Martin called Gerald. Gerald listened without interrupting, which was not his habit, and when he spoke he said 2 things. The first was that what Sharon had assembled was more substantial than anything he had seen from an individual franchisee in this type of dispute. The second was that Martin needed to decide quickly whether he wanted to be named publicly, because the journalist's piece would require on-record contributors to carry weight, and anonymous sources would not produce the same pressure. Going on record meant Meridian would know it was him. He was still under the agreement. He still had the non-compete clause. He still had a business, technically, though it was producing income that would not cover his mortgage and his own living costs simultaneously. He also had Rosie visiting in 3 weeks. He had a room with fairy lights and postcards. He had scrambled eggs waiting on Saturday mornings. He told Gerald he was in. The following 4 weeks were the most concentrated of his adult life. He compiled every document, every email, every portal interaction, every sales call recording he had kept on his phone. He wrote a 12-page statement of his experience. He participated in a group call with Sharon, 2 other franchisees, and the journalist, all conducted through a secure channel. He read a draft of the piece and provided corrections on 3 factual points. He waited. The article published on a Thursday morning in April. It named Meridian Franchise Holdings, described the income projection discrepancy, outlined the resale approval conduct, named the director with connections to 2 dissolved franchise companies, and included 4 on-record accounts from franchisees. Martin's account was second in the piece. His name was there in full. The British Franchise Association issued a statement the following Tuesday. Meridian's membership had been suspended pending a formal review. The suspension was effective immediately. Meridian's legal team sent Martin a letter on the Wednesday. It was not warm. It cited his public participation as a potential breach of the agreement's non-disparagement clause. It reserved the right to pursue damages. Gerald responded the same day with a letter that was considerably longer and considerably more specific, citing the BFA's published code of conduct, the documented income projection discrepancy, the refused resale applications, and the question of the director's previous associations. The counter letter from Meridian arrived 3 weeks later. It was different in tone. It proposed a mediated settlement discussion. Martin sat in Gerald's office on a Thursday afternoon and listened to what a settlement discussion might produce. Gerald was careful not to create expectations. What mediation could potentially produce was a structured exit from the agreement, a release from the non-compete clause, and a partial financial settlement. Not full recovery of the franchise fee. Partial. Somewhere, Gerald estimated, between 20 and 40% of the total invested, though the range was genuinely wide and dependent on how many franchisees participated and how the BFA review concluded. Martin did the arithmetic. 20% of what he had invested was roughly £22,000. 40% was roughly $44,000. Either number set against what he had spent was not a recovery. It was a partial reduction of a loss that would still define the rest of his financial life. He was 45 years old. His savings were gone. His mortgage was still £66,000. His pension, which he had contributed to through Fenwick and through the years of self-employment, had not been touched and currently had a projected value of around £80,000 at retirement, reduced from earlier projections because of the years of gap. His house had appreciated somewhat, and his equity was around £110,000. He was not destitute. He would not lose the house if he found work quickly. But the foundation his father would have recognized, the savings, the cushion, the thing he had built across 25 years of careful, deliberate, lunch-making, direct debit setting, never buying on credit choices, that was gone. The mediation took 11 weeks. 5 franchisees participated. Sharon coordinated the documentation. The BFA completed its review in the 8th week and formally withdrew Meridian's membership, a relatively rare action that was covered briefly in several trade publications, and received a single mention in a consumer rights blog that drew, according to Sharon's contact at Franchise Business Today, about 12,000 readers. Meridian settled. Martin received £26,400. It was roughly 23% of what he had paid and lost. The settlement included a structured exit from the agreement, immediate release from the non-compete clause, and a mutual non-disparagement provision going forward that was, Gerald noted with quiet dryness, considerably more balanced than the one Meridian had initially tried to invoke against him. Martin signed the settlement on a Tuesday morning. He transferred the money into his savings account that afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the balance. He called Rosie that evening. She was back in Edinburgh by then, back at school, and she answered after 2 rings the way she always did when she knew it was him. They talked about a school trip she was planning, about a film she wanted to watch on Friday, about whether he thought she should try out for the debate team. He told her he thought she would be brilliant at debate. She said she was thinking about it. He did not mention the settlement. He mentioned it was a good day. She accepted that. He took the cleaning business seriously for another 4 months, building the client base to a point where it was generating consistent revenue, and then he sold it. Not through Meridian, who were in no position to obstruct anything. Through a direct private sale to a local cleaning company that wanted to absorb his contracts and his 1 member of staff into their own operation. He received £9,500. It was a fair price for what it actually was. He found work 7 weeks later, not in logistics management, in operations consultancy, specifically working with small and medium-sized businesses on process and workflow. His logistics background translated. His years at Fenwick became a credential rather than a liability because he was now a consultant with his own experience, not an employee waiting to be compared to someone younger and cheaper. He started at £48,000 a year and was told plainly there was scope to grow. He wore his own clothes to work. The financial picture at the end of it all was not comfortable, but it was honest. He had entered the franchise period with £153,000 in liquid assets plus a house and a pension. He had recovered $26,000 through settlement and $9,000 through the business sale. He had earned approximately $31,000 from the business across its 18 months of trading. He had spent all of it and more on living costs, legal fees, and the business itself. He was left with savings of approximately £14,000, which was less than he had saved by the time he was 26. He had to rebuild from 45. That was the real sentence. Not 44 the year it happened. 45, the year he understood it fully. There is a particular kind of loss that does not fit easily into any category you are given as a child. It is not losing money through recklessness, which comes with a clear moral lesson your father could have told you about. It is not losing money to bad luck, which is understood and forgiven. It is losing money through effort, through preparation, through research, through professionalism, through everything you were told would protect you, and discovering that the system you thought you understood had mechanisms inside it that were invisible until you were already through the door and it had closed behind you. Martin thought about the 3 franchisees Meridian had given him as references. He had wondered for a while whether they knew, whether they were participants in something deliberate. But when he asked, through Sharon, one of them confirmed they had been approached by Meridian's sales team and asked if they would take reference calls, and they had agreed because they genuinely believed their experience was representative. They did not know that their results were outliers. They were not part of a deception. They were just the people at the top of a distribution that Meridian had chosen carefully and placed at the front of the room. That detail, more than almost anything else, stayed with him. The mechanism was so precisely calibrated that even the people inside it did not always understand how it worked. He started cooking properly again in the spring after the settlement. He had lived on toast and convenience meals for most of the franchise period, not because he could not afford better, but because he had no time and no energy. He made a lamb stew one Sunday afternoon in April that his father used to make, onions and rosemary and a low oven, the smell of it filling the house for 3 hours. Rosie was visiting that weekend. She ate 2 bowls and said it was the best thing she had eaten all year, which was probably an exaggeration, but not by as much as it should have been. He had been living on toast for too long. He kept the receipts from the legal process. He kept Gerald's letters and Meridian's letters and the settlement document and the BFA press release. He kept them in the same manila folder from the car park outside Gerald's office on that Tuesday evening 14 months ago. He kept the folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, not because he needed to read it, but because there was something in keeping it that felt important. He did not want to forget that he had been capable of walking into something like this. He did not want the memory to soften into something easier to carry, because softer memories make worse warnings. He would tell anyone who asked that the most dangerous part of the whole experience was not signing the agreement. The most dangerous part was the feeling, which was genuine and not irrational, that he had done his homework. The spreadsheet, the solicitor, the reference calls, the BFA listing. He had followed every sensible step he knew to follow, and the system he was entering had been specifically shaped to look exactly like what those sensible steps would approve. It passed every test he had because it had been built to pass every test he had. That is the thing about a well-designed trap. It does not look like a trap. It looks like the door you were looking for. It looks like the future you planned for. It looks, especially when you are 44 and newly redundant and quietly frightened and trying very hard to feel in control of something, exactly like what you need. He still drove a Volvo. A different one, 3 years newer, purchased secondhand through a private seller for £11,000, which he considered entirely reasonable. He still made his own lunch most days. He still had the direct debit to the hospice. He had reinstated it 8 weeks after the settlement cleared at the same amount, and the automated email confirmation arrived on a Thursday morning, and he read it and thought of his father and did not think of it again for the rest of the day, which is what his father would have done. Rosie made the debate team. She called him from Edinburgh on a Wednesday evening to tell him, and he could hear in her voice the specific pitch of a child who has been waiting all day to share something. He kept her on the phone for 40 minutes. He asked every question he could think of. He made her tell him what the first topic would be, and then he argued both sides just to hear her knock them down. She did. He went to sleep that night later than he should have, the way you do when a day ends better than it started, and the house was quiet in a way that felt comfortable rather than empty, and the bottom drawer of the desk in the spare room held everything that had happened, and it stayed there, and the rest of the house was his. There are things a disclosure document will not tell you. There are things a solicitor cannot find in a contract review. There are questions that only become visible after you have paid the price for not knowing to ask them. And there are industries that have spent considerable time and legal budget ensuring that the gap between what they imply and what they guarantee remains exactly wide enough to drive a franchise model through. Martin was not unusual. He was not naive. He was not reckless or greedy or impatient. He was a careful man who encountered something that had been built to defeat careful men, and it worked, and he recovered as much as someone in his position could reasonably recover, and it cost him 25 years of savings and 18 months of his life, and something harder to name that lives in the space between who you believed you were and what turned out to be possible. He still keeps the folder. He says it is so he does not forget. But there is probably also something in it that is simply the need to hold the proof that it happened, that it was real, that he did not imagine it. Because sometimes the losses that leave the deepest marks are not the ones that arrive loudly. They are the ones that arrive wearing the right clothes, using the right language, checked against the right lists, and still take everything. That is worth remembering, not as a lesson, just as something true.